Okay. Away we go. So I just put a note here for myself that I wanted to say this again. I know I try to say this often, but perhaps I don't say it often enough. I want to remind you that this series is not intended to tell you what you have to believe, what Lutherans all believe, what you must believe to be a Lutheran, or that a certain denomination is wrong. So, don't feel like I'm here telling you what to believe. I hope nobody ever feels that way. But I think it's helpful to explore together, to discuss different perspectives on ideas and questions, and try to understand how those ideas impact the bigger picture of our systems of belief, so that we can learn how to, look at our own faith with a critical eye, so that we can hold up different alternatives and consider them and criticize them, and just try to do our best to develop the strongest faith systems that we can. And that's going to look different for each of us. So I hope that you keep that in mind always as we have these conversations. And today's topic is not anything special in terms of feeling like I need to say that, but every once in a while I want to make sure that I say that again, because I want this to be a place where we can share ideas and throw out our crazy concepts and insights, and just kind of put it all on the table and work on it together. And each of us is going to put the pieces of the puzzle together a little differently, and that's okay. That's how it should be. So I just wanted to put that out there to all of you and to our listeners who don't get a chance to come in and talk to us too. Oh, no. Where's my question? There you are. So today's question is, how can a baby be a sinner? How can a newborn come into this world and already be a sinner? So as usual, we will start with some of our assumptions and then move into some topics and then maybe come to some potential conclusions. If you have any new questions that have come up recently or that come up today, let me know and we can add them to our list for future weeks. So getting started today with our assumptions, I think the first assumption that is kind of obvious within the question itself is the idea that newborn babies are sinners. If the question is, how are newborn babies sinners? Then I guess they are. We're kind of assuming that they are. And when I was thinking about that question and the assumptions that it raises, it reminded me of an experience that I had right after I graduated from college. I graduated a semester early from college, and so I had about 6 months, maybe I guess a little more than 6 months, 9 months, 8 months, between college and when I started graduate school. And because I didn't go straight from college to graduate school, I had to start making payments on my student loans just for a little while before I could put them back in deferment when I went on to graduate school. And so as the time when I had to start paying approached, I received a phone call from a representative from the loan company. And she got me on the phone and she said, so you've got all these different loans, each one, each time you take out more money for a new semester, it gets a new loan number. So all these different loans that are underneath our umbrella of your relationship with us. And the majority of them are federally subsidized loans. And in order to reduce your monthly payment, I think that you should consolidate your loans. And so I said, oh yeah, that sounds great. I'm not going to be paying on them for too long here, but that way at the end of graduate school, when I do start paying on them, I won't have to worry about any of that, blah, blah, blah. So we went through the process to consolidate. And then I received a statement in the mail that told me, kind of what all the different loans were and how they had been consolidated, and then what was going to happen moving forward. And it said that she was right, that most of my loans were subsidized by the federal government, so I didn't have to accrue any interest while they were deferred. But there was a very, very small, it was like $350 of unsubsidized federal loan that had gone on there because one semester, I guess, I exceeded the maximum cap for the subsidized loans or something. And so I had to, they had to borrow an extra $350 that was unsubsidized. So I thought, oh, well, so that while I'm in graduate school, this, small amount isn't accruing interest, I'll just send them a check for $350 so that I can take care of this loan, and, it won't, the interest won't be accruing for the next 3 or 4 years while I'm in graduate school. So I sent them this check, and they ended up sending it back to me. And I called them and I said, what's going on with this? And the woman that I talked to said, well, you chose to consolidate your loans. And so if you want to pay off this loan, now you have to pay the entire amount of all the combined loans because it's all considered to be one loan now. You can't pay off a piece of this loan. It's now all one loan. And I was so upset about this, that this other person had not told me this, had not, recommended to me that I pay off this piddling little amount, had gone on and consolidated this tiny little amount into this huge number that of course I could not pay off all at once. So that now for the next 3 to 4 years while I was in graduate school, interest would be accruing on this $350. And, it wasn't going to turn out to be a big amount in the long run, but it was the principle of the thing. Why would this person be so evil as to intentionally do this to me, knowing that I didn't understand it, knowing that I, would be hurt by it. And whenever I get mad, I cry. I don't rant and rave, I cry. And so I was just sobbing in anger and frustration and hopelessness over this. And my mother comes in and she says to me, I just said, how could somebody do this? How could somebody be so bad that they would hurt a complete stranger in this way? And my mom said, well, everybody is sinful, and this person is corrupted by their sin, and everybody's sinful. And I don't know how we got into the conversation, how it turned into this, but she was telling me that everybody is inherently sinful, even babies. And she said, the way that you know that is because babies are selfish. Babies are constantly crying and wailing and freaking out, and all they want is stuff for me, 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 me. And that proves that babies are sinful. And clearly this was incredibly impactful for me. This is something that I still remember to this day. This conversation that I had with my mom. We didn't really talk about, God and religion and things like that too much, at least in terms of stuff like this. And so, this encounter with her was really something, to remember. But I've been thinking about what she said pretty much since then, on and off, because I don't know if I can agree with her on that, even in some of the fundamental premises. And so I want to share with you some of the problems that I have with this, some of the questions, I guess, that this statement raises. When we talk about newborn babies being sinners, then we have to ask questions like, is our biological impulse to stay alive a sin? Is it wrong for us to want to maintain the sanctity of the life that God has given to us as a gift? I think that, that it's a complicated question, because I would, my impulse would be to say, of course not. God gave this to us as a gift. If we were to say, oh, well, my very existence, being impactful in a harmful way to someone else means that I shouldn't be alive, I shouldn't exist, that denies the sanctity of God's image in us. That denies the spirit of God that was breathed into us to give us animation and life. And so is it wrong that we're alive? Is it wrong that we're trying to stay alive? I don't know. That's kind of what my mom was indicating, that it's a sin for a baby to cry because it needs sustenance, because it needs comforting. And then, it kind of gets into issues of motivation. Obviously, babies have no concept that they are, putting out their mothers or putting out their caretakers to take care of them. They don't even understand that there is something outside of themselves. All they know is that they have a need and it's not being fulfilled right now. And so they respond to that. So do our motivations matter in whether something can be called a sin? If my motivations are pure, or my motivations are, based on my limited knowledge and understanding, then can it be called a sin? And then finally, I thought about, the structure of the world, the structure of sin. Our world is set up in such a way that from the moment we're born, we have needs, and we cannot fulfill those needs on our own. And so we kind of live in an eat or be eaten kind of world. We live in a, I've got to look out for me to a certain degree, or, I'm not going to be able to survive. And can we as individuals be blamed? Can babies be blamed for the way that our world is structured, or not? So I don't have any answers to any of these questions, but these are the questions that kind of come to my mind as we start to enter into this question. Any other questions or thoughts or suggestions toward this kind of? Obviously, we're going to get deeper into the question itself, but anything else that kind of comes up in terms of the assumptions or that kind of thing?
It reminds me of the conversations back in the 60s and 70s, probably about situational ethics, and how do you define sin based on the situation someone's in. And the example always was, is it a sin to steal food to feed your family?
Yeah.
But similar kinds of things. Yeah, it comes down to a definition of sin, I guess.
Yes. So that's what kind of what we're going to talk about today. How do we define sin? What is sin, and how does it, apply to newborn babies or others who, on the face of it, seem like they should be considered to be blameless because they either haven't had time to do anything wrong, or don't understand that they're doing something wrong, or what have you. So I think it will be helpful for us to just take a moment to consider a vocabulary term, if you will, total depravity. This concept is developed out of Paul's argument in Romans chapters 1-3, where he talks about, mostly he's talking about sin and kind of the how everyone, Jew and Gentile, is in the same boat in relationship to sin. But he has some things to say that I think are helpful for us as we kind of start to dive into this question. Total depravity is not a term that is used in all different Christian churches, but it is one that's used for Lutherans, and John Calvin loved talking about total depravity. So the Reformed churches and Lutheran churches are into this concept. So I just pulled out, I didn't want us to have to read the entirety of Romans 1-3, so I just pulled out a couple of verses for us to look at. Romans 1:21 says, "So they are without excuse, for though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. And then Romans 3:23 says, for there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So this shows us that sin is universal. All humans are under the power of sin. How that works and where it comes from is up for debate, and we'll talk more about that, but we can't really debate that sin is does not affect a certain people or anyone. And then it also shows us that sin affects all aspects of creation, and that's where the total depravity part comes in. And some people get confused by this total depravity thing. And partially, I would say that is the fault of people like Luther, because they kind of reinterpreted the concept. But total depravity, I think, in its original sense, refers to the breadth of the effect of sin, and not necessarily to the depth of the effect of the sin. And so, by way of example, to explain that, we talked, was it last week or the week before, a little bit about those videos of Hitler smiling and playing with dogs and, being kind of a regular human. Even Hitler had his quote unquote redeeming qualities. He liked dogs. He was kind to them. Presumably he had some relationships in his life where he had love for other humans. So his total depravity is not the idea that you are completely corrupted all the way through and nothing about you is can possibly be seen as good. Total depravity is about the breadth of the effects, that it affects all aspects of our lives, all aspects of the creation. Everything is touched by sin in some way, shape, or form. So that's something that is an important distinction, I think. Everything that we think, everything that we do, everything that we are is tainted by sin, because everything we think and do and are arises out of what this Romans chapter 1 passage tells us is a situation in which we're alienated from God. That it says that we did not honor God. We knew who God was, but we didn't honor God. We didn't give thanks to God. Our senseless minds were darkened, it says, and we're going to talk more about what that might mean throughout our time together today. So before we jump into kind of the main meat of today, any questions or comments about these introductory pieces? Okay. All right, so today we are going to talk about the doctrine of original sin, and we're going to have two competing understandings of how this works. In this corner, we've got St. Augustine of Hippo, woo, and in this corner, we've got Pelagius the heretic, boo, hiss, boo. All right. So these are our two main players for today. And we're going to find out why they, get the applause or the boo hissing as we talk about what they have to say. But I think that perhaps, well, I know that there's a lot about St. Augustine that I don't like and I don't agree with. And there are some things that Pelagius said that I do like. I was talking to Bob earlier this week and said to him that probably I could be accused of being a semi-Pelagian. I don't completely buy into what he's saying, but I like a lot more of his concepts than I'm sure the early church fathers who deemed him a heretic and excommunicated him would like. I would probably get myself excommunicated too with some of the things that I'm going to say to you today. So I'm really glad that that our current bishop does not seem to be the type to excommunicate anyone. Right, so here we go.
You're safe.
Let's talk about Pelagius first, our heretical friend here. He was born approximately 355 and died approximately 420, and this is in the CEs, the Common Era AD, some people say. And Pelagius was Celtic. He was from the British Isles. so the very outskirts of the Roman Empire. And he came to Rome around the year 380 so that he could study the law. And Pelagius believed that freedom of the will is required so that we have the possibility of doing good, so that we can attempt to do good. And therefore, it must be possible to choose to follow the law to perfection. If God demands that we follow the law to perfection, which the Bible tells us is true, then it has to be possible for us to do it, because God can't demand something that's impossible from us. That would be unfair, that would be unjust, and that's not who God is. And so Pelagius said that if God demands it of us, then it's possible for us to do it. We must have the freedom to choose what's right, and we must have that freedom all the time so that we can do it to perfection. It is possible to be perfect in our adherence to the law. So that's obviously something that's very different than what we hold to today. Pelagius also thought that it was not fair to punish one person for the sins of another. And so he believed that infants are born without sin, that they earn their own condemnation by sinning on their own accord, that they choose to sin. Each individual person chooses to sin. That it's possible not to do it, but that each individual person chooses it. He believes that Adam is a bad influence. He's an evil influence because he was a bad example. Not because we inherit some kind of DNA corruption on human nature in general, but because each of us individually looks at Adam and kind of follows in his footsteps and decides to do what he did. So he believes that there's no such thing as a quote unquote sinful nature. We don't inherit this. There's nothing inherently corrupted about the world. It's just that all sins are individual choices. He believes that over the course of time, we develop sinful habits. And so each sin is its own choice and must be repented of so that we can receive God's forgiveness and God's grace.
So, Katie, why was he declared a heretic? I'm
all this
missing
stuff.
something. Oh, just because of all this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he said that there are no excuses because all Christians are able to, they are physically and mentally and emotionally able to choose sinless lives. And therefore God expects that of them. And so he believes that, there's still space for grace here. He believes that God's grace can be found first in creating our brains, creating our ability to reason, to use logic, and our ability to choose to fulfill God's demands. And God's grace also exists in forgiving those sins. When we repent of them, God will readily forgive us of those sins. But that there's no need for some kind of universal redemption, because there's nothing wrong with the world. The problem is us. The problem is our bad choices that we make. And so he and I think this is probably where things really start to go downhill for him in terms of the excommunication thing. He believes that because there's no sinful nature, because there's no inherent corruption in the creation and in the world and in us, we don't need Jesus to die on the cross to redeem that. What we need from Jesus is a good example, a counterbalance to the bad example that Adam gives us, so that we can learn and do better in making our choices, so that we can follow Jesus in how we live our lives and make our habits so that we can avoid sin. So you can see kind of how that diminishes what Christ accomplished on the cross. He's a good example for us to follow. He's not someone who accomplished something once and for all for us. Now, the interesting thing.
That's what I think.
Oh, go ahead.
That's odd, because that's kind of what I think.
Mhm,
So
interesting.
here I am, a heretic.
You can join the club, Pam.
Good thing my church doesn't excommunicate us.
So the interesting thing with Pelagius is that none of his ideas were really particularly new. Earlier theologians who were not excommunicated, like Origen, who came several centuries before Pelagius and Augustine, held to many of these same positions. Justin Martyr is another example. Most of the apologists, who were the ones that were kind of in that transitional period out of the biblical period, but before kind of the development of the church into its proper form, like with Pelagius and Augustine. Most of those guys were apologists, and most of them had similar ideas to Pelagius. But Pelagius had the bad luck of forming all of these different ideas that were kind of out there with these earlier thinkers into a coherent system that he wanted to adhere to. And that system was kind of presented and established in opposition to his contemporary Augustine. And so his timing was just really bad on this. I think that's kind of what the problem was for Pelagius. And so in 418, Pelagius was deemed a heretic, and he is still condemned by the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. There are some churches that call him Saint Pelagius, but there are others, like the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, that still spit on his grave metaphorically, and he is still excommunicated and a heretic for them. So that's Pelagius. And I can see where he's coming from with a lot of this stuff. Like I said, I don't agree with him completely. I think that he's missing some stuff. I think he's missing some biblical interpretation and understanding of some of the things that the Bible tells us, and I think that he's missing some anthropology. I think he doesn't quite understand, who we are at the core of it. I don't have quite the positive view of humanity that he has, but I think he's got some important things to say. I still think it's unfair to punish one person for the sins of another. I don't think it's fair if God demands that we be perfect and knowing that we can't. So, I'm on board with that kind of stuff. So any questions, comments on Pelagius? All right. So then in the other corner of our boxing ring, we've got Augustine. And we've talked about Augustine before, a couple of times actually in this series with our questions. But I want to just focus on what he has to say about sin and where sin comes from. Augustine, I think, first of all, he comes from a much more pastoral approach in his theology than Pelagius did. Pelagius just had no time for people to make excuses and about their sins. He said, this is on you. This is your choice. You had the choice to do something better, and you didn't do it. And so you either need to ask for forgiveness or face the consequences. But Augustine was a little bit more pastoral. He understood that spiritual growth is slow and halting and painful. He was more honest about the reality of our situation. He saw how frail we are as humans, and he understood that true perfection is not possible through our own efforts. And so he asked the question, why is that? Why, even if we want to be perfect, why is it that we can't do it? And so he is the one who kind of really came up with this doctrine of original sin originally. He believes that original sin is the consequence of the fall of Adam. And he believes that there are two parts to that fall. He believes that in Adam, all people through all places and all times receive excuse me, receive guilt responsibility. So there's guilt for all people. He said that we, as the descendants of Adam, share directly in responsibility for his sinful choice, because somehow, in some kind of mystical but very real sense, we were all there with Adam. We all chose to sin along with Adam. So he kind of turns Adam into not just the representative of all humanity, but somehow he embodies all of humanity. And for Augustine, I think that he would say that the reason he can say that is because we all come, from Adam. Our bodies, our personalities are kind of inherited through the generations from Adam, and so we were all there in some kind of spiritual, but also physical, almost sense. Augustine says that there is a misalignment, a problem, a corruption of human nature as we were originally created. Before the fall, Adam had desires and bodily passions, but they were under the control of his intellect. So his nature was properly aligned. His intellect, his logic, his mind was in control, and his kind of baser passions, his desires and bodily needs were under the control of his intellect. But then after the fall, his bodily passions started to dominate, and then forced his will, forced his mind, forced his logic to create rationalizations for what he wanted, rather than allowing his mind to kind of control and direct his passions and bodily desires. So you can see here the beginning of the development of this very anti-body, anti-sex, anti-pleasure Christianity. And this is not this didn't originate with Augustine, but it certainly reached its height with Augustine. And I would say that, generally speaking, all of the misaligned relationships that we have today with Christianity and sex Christianity and indulging in food Christianity and basically any kind of pleasure in life can be traced directly back to our friend Augustine. And so I have some problems with him in relationship to that, because I think he's done a lot of harm through some of those things. And we're going to talk a little bit more too about his problems with sex in a little bit. So what Augustine kind of came around to with this was that what happened in the fall was that we replaced our love of God, which was the correct way to align ourselves, with love of self. We wanted to fulfill our own needs, fulfill our own desires, fulfill our own passions. And so because of the fall, our relationship with God is damaged. And because of that damage to our relationship with God, our access to the source of life, to the source of hope, to the source of happiness is cut off. And so that means that spiritual death becomes possible and then becomes reality in our world. That's where kind of the relationship between sin and death comes from. Because our relationship with God is cut off or is damaged, then spiritual death becomes possible. He also is the one that originally kind of defined sin as putting ourselves at the center, turning in on ourselves. Life becomes about fulfilling our own desires and passions rather than having relationships with and impacting the lives of others around us in a positive way. And so we become slaves to our ignorance. We have lost our connection to the source of wisdom. We become slaves to death because we've lost the connection to the source of all life. And this slavery leads to the loss of our free will. We are unable to choose what is good because we don't even recognize it. We can't see it as a possibility over our own self-interest. And so you can see how this differs from Pelagius. He thinks that we can choose. We have the intellectual capacity to choose what is good, but we don't. Augustine says, no, this self-interest, this selfishness, this self-centeredness blinds us to what is good and prevents us from seeing it, because we are now slaves of ignorance and death. We have no connection to the source of wisdom. We have no connection to the source of life, because we've cut God off out of our lives in order to focus on our own interests. And so Augustine says, in order to be freed so that we can receive new access to the source of this power to do good, which is God, our natures must be renewed and restored into the right order. So we have to be restored into the image of God, that our creation in the image of God has been marred in some way. He believes that sin is not just a random set of isolated acts, like Pelagius says, but is part of this broken nature, this fundamental shift in who we are at the core. And so that's what makes him different from Pelagius.
Is that salvation?
Is what salvation?
Being restored.
Yes. But it must be done by an outside force. It must be done by God, because we're not capable of accomplishing it ourselves. So this is the standard, especially the standard that, for example, Luther bought into. Lutheran was an Augustinian monk, and so he was incredibly influenced by the works and thought of Augustine in his own life, in his own writing, in his own development of ideas. And this is pretty much the standard for pure theology in most churches. There is a lot of confusion of theology and kind of our secular morality, I think. A lot of people would say things like, well, I believe that people are basically good. And if you are a Lutheran and you understand Lutheran theology, that's kind of ironic, because Luther had one of the most, if not the most, kind of low anthropologies of any thinker ever. He just thought that humans, without God, humans are just dirt, worms, disgusting filth. And so he would have laughed in your face if you had told him that you believe that humans are basically good. And that's, Augustine is where all of those ideas come from. So I think that, generally speaking, if you kind of talk to the average person on the street, they would be more Pelagian than Augustinian. But the thing that Augustine has that Pelagius doesn't is he's got a lot more biblical foundation for his ideas. What the Bible says really supports what he has to say, more so than Pelagius. So questions on Augustine or anything that's come up about Pelagius now that we've gone through this side of things? All right. So next, as we kind of wind our way back toward, oh, Marge, did you have something? You're muted. I can't hear you. Sorry, I saw you make a face, but I can't hear you.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, the last slide, can you go back to the last one?
Yep.
Where it says where he believes we replace the love of God with the love of self. I don't understand why you can't. I don't know that I love myself, but I don't see why you can't do both. Why does he believe that one is over the other? That you can love God and think, love yourself by doing things that are good. I don't quite understand that one, I guess.
I think he would say that loving yourself means focusing all of your attention on what you want, what you need. He would say that you are no longer controlling your own desires and your own bodily passions. Your priority is me. What do I want?
Okay.
What do I need?
Okay, I don't think that's what it is, but who am I?
I think that's what he would say.
Okay,
But doesn't that take you back to the baby?
Yes.
oh, yeah,
So that's kind of what he would say about the babies.
Okay.
So the next thing that we need to cover so that we can understand where this idea about babies comes from is, where does a soul come from? This might seem a little bit off base, but this is important. So there are basically two competing theories about where souls come from. The first one is creationism. Under creationism, just the name for this particular theory of where souls come from, human souls are just spirit. They're not anything physical or metaphysical. They are purely spirit, and they exist before they are placed into bodies. For some theologians who like creationism, they believe that souls are quite a bit older than the bodies that they inhabit. Some of them believe that they are almost eternal, that they've been around, since the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth and all the souls that would ever exist. And now over the course of what we perceive as time, those souls are being, shoved into their bodies as those bodies build. Others think that souls are created kind of as they go along, so that when a new body is developing at some point during that process, God creates the soul and inserts it into the body. And so there are people who are all along the spectrum with that. But the point is that that God creates each soul separately. Each soul is a special creative act of God directly. And somehow at some point that soul is implanted into the fetus that is developing. So Pelagius, of course, it seems obvious that he would really like this theory, because it fits into the idea that sin is just separate acts that are not related to the nature of the being that is committing those acts. Sin is transmitted not through souls or through DNA or through some other means. Sin is just comes out because we personally choose to sin. We potentially see a bad example and we follow that bad example, and so we start the process of sinning on our own volition, because there's no inheritance. Every soul is created on its own. The other side of this debate about different theories about where souls come from is called Traditionalism. And under this category, God does not create each individual soul. Souls are considered to be almost physical objects, almost physical body parts. Obviously, people who adhere to Traditionalism today wouldn't take this completely literally, because we understand more about the human body, and nobody can say, oh yes, let's open up this cadaver and there's the soul right there. But they still kind of understand it as something somehow mysteriously connected to biology. So souls are physical objects like livers or brains that are part of the reproductive process. The belief that you can have your mother's soul in the same way that you can have her eyes or her feet or her nose. You inherit your soul from your parents. And so the difference here is that in creationism, God creates each individual soul as a unique creative act. But on this side, God is not the one who's creating the souls individually, but God provides for the humans to create the souls of their children through the reproductive process. And so it's almost as if, in the reproductive process, I grew my children's noses, my children's eyeballs, my children's livers. And if I adhere to Traditionalism, my children's souls, they inherited pieces of me and pieces of my husband, and they received that as their soul. And so therefore, the sin that I inherited from my parents, who inherited it from theirs and theirs and theirs all the way to Adam, comes down through us and corrupts our souls when we receive it from our parents. And so Augustine liked this one. God created the soul, kind of the concept of the soul, as part of the creation of the first human, and all other souls have been produced through the natural process of sexual reproduction, which means that original sin transmits through this natural process, and our corruption is inherited. So that therefore it affects us from the moment that we are conceived. As soon as we're conceived, what our noses are going to look like, what our ears are going to look like, what our toenails are going to look like, and what our souls are going to look like is established by biology, by DNA. And so this is where Augustine comes around to his deep and desperate aversion to sex. He thinks that sex is evil because it is the mechanism through which we propagate sin. We bring more sin into the world. I don't know if he would say this. I never read him saying this anywhere, but I would imagine that all else being equal, he would probably say that it would be better for humans to just not reproduce and let everybody die off, because sex is so evil, and you definitely shouldn't engage in that. So questions about this? This is kind of interesting and different.
He didn't even know about climate change.
No, he did not.
Well, there again, you have to kind of go with the creationism idea of each soul separately. The other one, I'm not familiar with that word. Where does that word come from?
It's I don't know if it's Latin or Greek, but it comes from a root that means like transfer and a Passover.
Okay.
Hmm.
It almost sounds like reincarnation, like people are just recycled.
Yeah, I
Or
don't think I would.
at least their souls are,
Yeah, I don't think I would go in that direction with it. I think I would try to think of it more like biology, that
Okay.
I still have my own eyeballs, but my son, quote unquote, has my eyes. When you look at him, you say, oh yeah, you guys have the same color eyes. I think you would see it more like that it's,
Yeah. Okay.
it's what were those diagrams that we used to have to do in biology class with the chromosomes and the dominant and recessive genes? You know what I'm
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah.
So like you would have one of those for soul,
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know. They both have something going for them.
Yeah, I think so. But the assumption here is that sin gets into you through your soul in Traditionalism. But if God creates each soul separately, then there is no sin in a baby. And so Traditionalism is required for kind of the standard, line that most churches take today, that we are born corrupted. We are born, our nature is somehow marred, from what it should be.
Because of the process of conception.
Yeah, that's how Augustine would describe it.
Well, that's kind of a catch-22. if you don't reproduce, the people would die out. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I thought God said, go forth and multiply. So
Yes. Yes. So if multiplying means more sin in the world, then why would God say that?
right.
So maybe Traditionalism isn't necessarily completely true. Maybe it's got a couple of interesting and helpful things in it, but Creationism maybe has something to say too.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on here and talk a little bit about why Augustine was victorious. And like I said earlier, I think it's mostly that he has a much more robust set of biblical texts that support his ideas about this sinful nature thing. And, what he has to say makes a lot more sense to people who are living on the ground and actually, trying to be good people. That if Pelagius is right, and I want to be good, and I want to do the right thing, and I want to choose good, then why do I end up sinning all the time? And that brings us to Romans chapter 7. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold into slavery under sin. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Why? Why is this the case? Why is it that that I can't seem to be unable to control myself? And Pelagius would say, well, you can. The problem is that Paul isn't trying hard enough, that he doesn't have enough control over himself, that he's he really secretly wants to sin. Augustine would say that there's something broken in you, that even if you want to do this, you can't. And therefore we need God. We need the redemption that Jesus Christ brings so that we are freed from this slavery to sin and freed for living in the repaired relationship that God has provided for us. And so that's why Augustine kind of won out over Pelagius in this kind of competition for whose ideas were going to take hold of the church. And poor Pelagius ended up getting the short straw and got excommunicated for it. Augustine, though, does have some flaws in his thinking. There is no biblical support for the idea of original sin. There is biblical support, like here, for the concept of a sin nature, the corruption of who we're supposed to be. But there's no biblical support for original sin. There's no support for the idea that God holds individuals responsible for the sins of other individuals. There is evidence that God holds us collectively responsible for the roles that we play in supporting and upholding the structures of our society, the structures of our world that harm others and harm our relationship with God. But the idea that we are guilty because of what somebody else did, because of what Adam did, that we were present there somehow, like Augustine said, there's no biblical evidence for that. And so we have to kind of take some of Augustine's stuff with a grain of salt, even though he's the one that won out and he's the one that, says things that make sense in the lived and practical, sense of it. So he was the winner, but I think that we still have some wrestling to do with these different ideas. So if we're thinking about not necessarily, the individual sins as the source here, but as this sinful nature, then what is that sinful nature? Where does that come from? And so I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to talk about what it means for us to be born into a sinful world. That newborn baby is born, and as soon as that baby is born, well, even while developing, that baby is part of a corrupted creation. So Psalm 51:5 says, "Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me." And Augustine used this passage as proof that sex itself is sinful, that in conceiving there is sin. But that's not what this says. I think what this says is that we as humans, no matter how small, no matter how young we are born into a world that is affected by sin. Everything is affected by sin. Remember that total depravity we talked about earlier, the breadth, it touches everything, even a zygote. And so Augustine would say that we have a sinful nature, that we have lost the image of God somehow, that sin has corrupted us to a fundamental degree. But he wouldn't go so far as to say that the loss of the image of God is fundamental to who we are, that somehow we are now, instead of being made in the image of God, we are in the image of Satan or something. He still believes firmly that sin is something that's added on to what we are as humans at our core, at the core of who we are created to be by God. We are still beloved creatures made in the image of God. And I think that's really important, a really important distinction, because Luther did suggest this as part of his theology. Like I said, he had one of the most robust, if not the most robust, understandings and concepts of sin and anthropology, low anthropology of any theologian of any time. But Augustine would not say that our fundamental natures are corrupted. He would say that something has been added on. And where does he get this idea? He gets it from Genesis chapters 1-3, asking the question, who are we? And we've talked before about how we read the Bible. Is a section of the Bible like Genesis chapters 2-3 supposed to be a chronicle of human history, telling us exactly what happened historically, literal facts? I don't think so. You can think that, like I've said before, it doesn't bother me. It doesn't matter to me. But I read the Bible. I read these stories from the perspective of their goal as trying to answer big questions. That if you let go of trying to figure out how historical facts fit into this and how things might have worked, logically and practically, then instead you can focus your attention on asking questions like, what does this story tell me about who I am? What does this story tell me about who God is? And when we read Genesis chapters 1-3 through that lens, then it tells us that humans were created good, that sin is something that was added to the creation, like Augustine said. That sin is not inherent to the core of who we are. God did not make something evil. God made something good. We also see in this passage that Adam's sin is not our own in any sense, except that when he sinned, the world that God created changed. It was no longer perfectly good in the way that God had declared it. And so when we are born, we're born into an environment that is different than the one that God intended for us. And I think that's something that we can all agree on, regardless of our understanding of where sin comes from. The world that we are born into is not the world that God intended for us. And I think looking at that environment that we're born into is important for understanding this concept about the newborn babies and how they could possibly be born as sinners. Because I don't think that we're looking necessarily for, or we shouldn't maybe be looking for necessarily how precisely the sin of Adam corrupts us as individuals. We're not going to be able to find that answer. There's no way to nail down the answer to that question. How does the sin of Adam corrupt us? But I think what we really want to know is not how that happened, but how we navigate in the world that is as it is. And so when we look at the environment instead of looking at the people, I think that can be really helpful for us, because the world we are born in is structured so that my survival has to be protected at the cost of my relationships with others. If I don't protect that, then my identity might be overwhelmed, my being might be overwhelmed. And so if we look at original sin as, instead of looking at it as something that we inherit through our souls, that's something that's kind of part of our being, what formed us, we could see that sin has created the individual person, that sin has cut us off from God, cut us off from our neighbors, cut us off from the rest of creation. Because when we look at them, when I look at one of you in my natural state, I see you as a threat. You are a threat to my freedom to exist, to have the identity that I have, something that I have to conquer, something that I have to dominate, something that I have to exploit. Because if I don't, then you're going to do the same thing to me. You're going to dominate me. You're going to exploit me. You're going to destroy me. And so I think that what Genesis 1-3 tells us is that what we are at our core is defined by our relationships to God, our relationships to others, our relationships to creation that God establishes with each of us. All of these relationships are part of that covenant that God makes with us. But the way that we live, our lived existence, doesn't match that core of who God created us to be. And so without God intervening, without the redemption that comes through Jesus Christ, this split, this division between who we are at our core, our fundamental essence, and the experiences that we have in our lived existence cannot be mended. And so we are hopeless to make that practice look like the reality. But it's through Christ that our true nature is revealed, and that we are able, through God's help, to triumph over our sin, to triumph over that natural tendency to see others as a threat, and instead to reestablish the correct relationships with God and with others and with the creation that God intended for us. And so I think that what Genesis 1-3 does is help us to see what sin is, because that's something that is kind of hard to nail down. It's about relationships, and it's about our refusal to prioritize those relationships. We prioritize ourselves and our own needs over others. And it helps us to understand that we are not that is not fundamentally who we are. God created us, and we are good. But there is this misalignment that exists. And so how do we navigate around that? So that's kind of where I come around with this. So what questions do you have about that, or comments?
Well, I like the part about, that we were created to be good, that we are good. I don't, it's very confusing, Katie. It's very confusing.
Don't forget about our motto.
I
What's
know.
that?
If you understand it, it's not God. Okay. So sin is something added on. I agree with that because I think you could be led into sin, like because we're human and we have so many conflicting things going on in us all the time. It's easy to be led in the wrong direction. And even with your thoughts, I mean, you don't even really have control all the time on your thoughts,
Sure.
But I always think of sin as separating yourself from God. And so I don't know what I'm trying to say.
No, I think that fits. Separating yourself from God means, cutting off that relationship that you were created for, right?
Right.
I don't know if I see sin as something that added on. I think of it more as we were even created with a capacity for sin, or otherwise there would never have been sin. So where does that, I mean, then you could say, well, the capacity to sin is part of being given free will. But it's all that free will, that capacity is always there. I don't see it as added on.
Yeah, the adding on part from Augustine, I wonder about that myself. I think that there's a possibility that you could actually invert that, and you could say that we are created good, but sin is something that takes away from that goodness.
Goodness. Yeah.
So it's not something that's added on, like Augustine says, but it's something that takes away from the natural state of us. And what's taken away is that capacity for true relationship, that capacity for trusting God to fulfill our needs and to hold us up in existing and having the things that we need to continue to survive and flourish, so that we feel like we have to do that ourselves.
Yeah. That makes sense. So then you go back to this thing of when God created Adam and Eve. If you look at that story, he knew they were going to sin.
Mhm.
And it was built in. I mean, is it something that's built in or is it something that's added on? I guess that's the fundamental question.
So Linda said the capacity to sin had to be
Yeah.
there in the creation. So is there a difference between creating sin and creating the capacity for sin, especially given that God knew that we were going to do it?
I know, it feels like a setup.
Or do we go back to my original, 22-year-old Katie anger and frustration, because how could God create a world where it's set up that way, where
But giving us the capacity to choose sin also gives us the capacity to choose good.
yes. But is it worth it?
To have otherwise you're God's robots? I don't know.
Right.
Okay, so how does Pelagius work with that one? If we have the possibility to be perfect, no, I can't even talk about this. We'll have to think about it.
All right, so we're starting to come around to some of these conclusionary comments. So I'll move on here. But if you have other things to say about the other, feel free to jump in, because we're starting to ask some of these questions. So when we ask the question, how can a newborn baby be a sinner? I think that there are some questions that we can't answer that don't allow us to completely answer this question. We don't know what the ideal state of the world is. We don't know what the world is supposed to look like. What does the world look like without sin? We don't know because we've never experienced that. We also don't know about, whether an individual is guilty even if their intent isn't to harm. Does our intention matter, or does only the result matter? And there are all kinds of movies and TV shows and books and all kinds of different media that address this question and try to ask this question, come up with some kind of answer for it, but we can never come to a satisfying conclusion about this question, I don't think. But when we're talking about newborn babies, I think that question is really important because of what we talked about. Babies are nothing but I, nothing but me, because they don't even know that there is another thing that exists outside of themselves. They don't have a concept of me versus other. It takes a while for them to even develop the idea that this being that is fulfilling my needs is not me. And so is it their fault that they are trying to just, exist, trying to fulfill their own, needs to succeed and flourish and not die and not stop existing, for their identity to remain? I would say no, but does that matter? Does it matter that they don't even know what they're doing? Or is it still sin because sin is, a static thing and intention doesn't matter? And then the last question I think, that's important here that we can't answer is, what makes us us? I believe that God protects the essence of who each of us is. God created us, God loves us. And so I think that the problem with sin is that we don't have enough trust. We don't trust that something outside of me would desire my flourishing, would desire my continued existence, because I see the world as well, if I don't get it for myself, then somebody else is going to get it and use it against me. That's my that's my assumption. That's the way that I look at the world because of the sin that exists within me. And so we know that God does protect the essence of each of us, what makes us us, whatever that is. We know that God is capable of providing opportunities for true relationship with other pieces of the creation and with God without destroying who we are, but we don't understand how that works. And so because we can't understand how it works, we can't trust it. We don't trust that God will do it or figure out a way to do it. And so I think that's where sin comes from, because we kind of feel like we have to take matters into our own hands. If I want to continue to exist, which is a perfectly natural biological thing, then I've got to do something to make that happen. And usually that means staving off the threats of other beings that want the same resources as me and need them as well to continue to exist. And so these are some things that we can't know, but there are some things that we can and do know. We do know that we were created good. We know that we were created to be in relationship. We know that those relationships are broken by our turned inwardness, by our selfishness, by our inability to trust what we can't control, which is everything outside of ourselves, so that we view others as our enemies. They're enemies of our own needs, they're enemies of our own desires, they're enemies of our own existence and identities. And we also know that sin is part of the social fabric of our world. Sin is even in the brain functions of those newborn babies. A newborn baby experiences delayed gratification for the very first time after it is born and interprets that as a threat to its existence. And I think that fundamentally how each of us responds to that threat to our own existence, or that perceived threat to our existence, is what makes us individual sinners. That we don't inherit sin. Sin is not something that is part of, some kind of corrupted soul that we get from our parents. But I think that each of us picks up the banner of our corrupted environment, in which it's kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. And we perpetuate that by making that choice on our own. From the second we're born, that first feeling of threat to our existence, we kind of snap into that place of, I must defend myself. I must continue to survive. What can I do? What do I have control over in this moment? And then that's kind of starts the process of developing the me versus them kind of mentality that is contrary to the way that God created us to be. So I think those are some of the things that we can know despite some of those questions. And then I think finally, the last thing that we also know is from John, 1 John chapter 3. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And so we know that our sin does not change our fundamental identity as children of God, that God loves. We don't know how our society will be transformed when the kingdom of God is fully revealed. That's still a mystery to us. But we do know that when we do see who God really is, when we do get to see the love that God has for us, the way that God is capable of holding fast and protecting what makes us us, while also opening us to relationship with others and to God. When we have the ability to trust, because we're not looking at God through the lens of our sin, but seeing God face to face, then that will transform our understanding of God, but it will also transform our own assumptions about ourselves, about our relationships with other people, about our priorities, so that we can understand that our fundamental being is secure in God, that we don't have to feel threatened by others, that we don't have to feel threatened by relationship with God, because being in relationship with God and others is actually fulfilling our identities, not taking them away. It's not a threat. It's the goal, really. And so then we can focus on reaching out to others instead of trying to preserve and protect ourselves, because we know that we're not preserving and protecting ourselves anyway. It's God who's been doing it all along. But that's not what we've seen yet in our experience of time and place. So we're still waiting for that time. But in the meantime, we can work to try to live that way to the best of our ability, knowing that, we can't do it perfectly, but that God is there with us, helping us along the way. So that's what I have for today.
So children who are not nurtured properly from the time they're babies can have some real serious problems with dealing with society and rules and other people, and can grow up really warped and full of sin. I mean, because they don't know God, they don't know anybody being kind to them, they don't experience the kinds of things that God wants for them. So when we see people that are in prison that find God and turn away from the life that they've been living, a lot of people will say, oh yeah, so they found God, now they're okay, But I think that God would reach out to them, because it wasn't their fault that they were raised that way. But I think they're powerless to change it. And so the parents are the ones that are the sinners. I don't know. I'm just thinking that it just seems so unfair that a baby can be just so corrupted from such a young age by not having someone respond to their needs. That's
Mhm.
not how it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Eric Erickson's stages of emotional development. The first, the first kind of crisis that has to be resolved for an infant is basic trust versus mistrust. And if
Right.
that crisis isn't resolved positively into basic trust, then none of the other identity and emotional development crises can develop properly. And so all of their relationships, their understanding of who they are, their experiences of shame and guilt and identity and meaning in their lives are impossible to resolve properly.
Yeah, they're corrupted. But I think God can be with them even then, and then they get to the point where they can make choices. They could choose to be different, but a lot of them don't. A lot of people like that don't. I don't know. This is a very complicated question. I thought, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. Of course not. Babies can't.
Well, you can blame Pat Martinez for this one.
Okay.
And where is she?
Yeah, you can send her an email and say, hey, how dare you ask this question and leave us
Thanks a
to deal
lot.
with it.
So I'm reading this book for the book group this afternoon at our church called Beyond Contempt. And it's kind of talking about the two political halves we have in our country and how you can talk to each other or not. And at one point, the author is talking about how we're basically genetically primed to look at things in a certain way. And then you have the way you're raised. And I haven't gotten to the part yet about how we can recover from this. So it seems to me this would all be part of like this sinful nature that we're born into or have or something, because there's the genetics and there's your environment and your experience. And I mean, and it's just kind of all in there interwoven. It seems like kind of a tight mesh right now. I'll let you know if it comes out differently.
Oh, that's good.
But I think it's really related. I mean,
Oh,
I
yeah.
guess there's not much in life that is not, because yeah.
Yeah, this question was simple on its face. How can a newborn baby be a sinner? But it's fundamentally about, the nature of sin and where sin comes from and what sin is and how we deal with it or not and whether we can deal with it. Deep and important questions.
Yeah.
All right, anything else from anybody today?
I'm exhausted.
I don't know how we're going to carry on, but we'll try.
All right, well, everybody go take a nap. Recover a little.
And Katie gets to do this again tonight.
I do. I love it.
Oh, good.
All right. Well, thank you
All right.
all for another good
Thank-
conversation and have a great weekend. See
And
you
we'll
next
see.
week. We will be
Thanks,
talking
Diane.
about what
You
is a
too.
cult?
Cool.
What is
Oh,
it called?
good.
Oh, good.
We might be able to wrap our minds around that one.
Another
Maybe a
easy
little bit.
question. Okay.
But Katie will take it to a different level.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.